April 16, 1945, 8:45 a.m., 30 miles north of Okinawa. A Japanese Zero screamed out of the morning sky at 300 miles per hour and slammed into the rear deck of USS Laffy. The explosion vaporized 6 men where they stood. Burning aviation fuel erupted in a 60-foot wall of fire. The ship shuddered like a wounded animal. Ammunition started cooking off in the heat each detonation, sending shrapnel tearing through flesh and steel alike. Commander Frederick Julian Beckton, standing on the bridge, watched the inferno consuming his ship's stern and did not flinch. Because that was only the 8th attack. 50 more contacts still tracked on the radar screen, and Beckton had already decided months before this moment that he would never lose another ship. Not this one. Not today. Not while a single gun could still fire. What happened next over the following 72 minutes would shock the Japanese Imperial Navy to its core, rewrite the rules of destroyer combat, and produce the most statistically impossible survival story in the history of naval warfare. 1 ship, 22 kamikaze attacks, 10 direct hits, 32 men dead, and yet somehow impossibly the USS Laffy refused to sink. This is the story of the ship that would not die. To understand why April 16, 1945 mattered so much, you need to understand what the waters around Okinawa had become by that spring. The Japanese military had unleashed Operation Kikusui, a strategy so desperate and so brutal that Allied commanders initially refused to believe the scale of it. Kikusui translated roughly as floating chrysanthemums. It was the largest organized suicide attack campaign in human history. The concept was simple and horrifying. Take young pilots, give them enough fuel for a one-way trip, load their aircraft with bombs, point them at American ships, and tell them to die for the Emperor. By April 1945, Japan had already lost the flower of its aviation corps. The experienced pilots who had bombed Pearl Harbor, who had sunk HMS Prince of Wales, who had dominated the Pacific skies in 1942, they were gone. Dead over Midway, over Guadalcanal, over the Philippine Sea. What remained were teenagers, farm boys, students, pulled from universities, given weeks of flight training instead of years, and sent to die. The results around Okinawa were catastrophic for the American fleet. In the weeks before April 16th, kamikaze attacks had damaged or sunk dozens of vessels. Destroyer Manert El Abele went down on April 12th after 2 hits. She sank in 4 minutes. 4 minutes. Bush went down April 6th after 3 kamikaze strikes, taking 2 hours to disappear beneath the waves. Colquhoun, same day, 4 hits gone in 30 minutes. The destroyers assigned to radar picket duty suffered worst of all. Picket stations formed a ring around the invasion fleet, early warning sentinels whose job was to detect incoming raids and direct combat air patrol to intercept them. It was essential work. It was also a death sentence. Radar picket destroyers sat alone far from the main fleet, broadcasting their position to every Japanese pilot in the air. Picket Station One was the most dangerous position of all. 30 miles north of Okinawa, 60 miles from the nearest fleet concentration. First ship the Japanese would encounter coming south. The northernmost target. The most isolated target. The first ship to die. 3 days before April 16th, destroyer Cassin Young had occupied Station One. She took 1 kamikaze hit. 1 man killed, 59 wounded. She limped away. Now the Navy needed a replacement. They sent USS Laffy. Frederick Julian Beckton was 36 years old in April 1945, which sounds young until you realize how much war he had already survived. Born in 1909, Naval Academy graduate career destroyer officer, he had spent the war in the worst places at the worst times, and he carried the weight of every man he had failed to save. November 13, 1942. Guadalcanal. Beckton stood on the bridge of USS Nicholas and watched the first USS Laffy burn and sink. He had not commanded that ship, but he had known her crew. 59 men went down with her. He memorized their faces. April 7, 1943. His own command, USS Aaron Ward. 3 bomb hits, 2 near misses. 20 killed, 59 wounded, 7 missing. The ship sank 600 yards from the beach. Becton spent 7 hours trying to save her, working damage control, directing firefighting, refusing to abandon the fight. Failed. The sea took her anyway. 2 ships, 2 losses, hundreds of dead men whose faces he saw when he closed his eyes. When the Navy gave him the second USS Laffy in February 1944, fresh from Bath, ironworks gleaming, and New Becton made a decision that his crew would come to curse before they eventually owe their lives to it. He decided this ship would be ready, completely obsessively, brutally ready. He drilled his men until they hated him. General quarters at 0300 in the morning, not because a threat was real, but because an enemy never checks your schedule before attacking. Damage control exercises in smoke-filled compartments, simulating the exact conditions they might face in combat. Gun crews practiced loading and firing blindfolded in complete darkness, because fires knock out lighting, and battles do not pause for crew comfort. Young sailors complained bitterly. Petty officers grumbled in passageways. Men wrote home that their commander was a lunatic. Becton heard the whispers and ignored every word. He had pulled dying men from burning compartments. He had watched destroyers break in half. He understood something his crew did not yet understand: the difference between a ship that survives and a ship that sinks is measured in seconds, and seconds are purchased with months of repetition. The Laffy went to Normandy first. June 6, 1944, D-Day. She escorted landing craft to Utah Beach, then screened the battleships bombarding German coastal positions. German shore batteries at Cherbourg targeted her on June 25th. She laid smoke, took fire, maneuvered through it. Not a single man lost. Becton's training held. Then the Pacific. Leyte Gulf, Philippines. December 1944. Becton watched kamikaze after kamikaze destroy American ships within sight of his position. One transport incinerated in seconds after a direct hit. A destroyer nearby took a strike and had to be scuttled, her crew pulled from burning water. Laffy assisted with damage control on a wounded ship, and Becton's crew saw up close what aviation fuel did to human beings. Burned men screaming. Flesh melted to bone. They learned what they were fighting. January 1945, Lingayen Gulf. 11 American ships damaged by suicide aircraft in a single day. Laffy maneuvered through burning oil slicks and floating debris, evading every attack through aggressive helmsmanship and gunfire. Still no direct hit. Becton knew the statistics were not on his side. He kept drilling his men anyway. April 14, 1945. Laffy arrived at Okinawa and took her position at Picket Station One, the spot where Cassin Young had just been damaged, the most dangerous water in the Pacific Ocean. April 15th passed quietly. Too quietly. Veterans knew what silence before a storm felt like. April 16th, 1945. 8:30 a.m. Becton stood on the bridge and watched his radar operator track 50 contacts moving south at 200 knots. 50 Japanese aircraft in a single formation, part of the massive 5th Kikusui wave, and USS Laffy was alone at the northern tip of the picket ring with 2 small landing craft as her only companions. He called for combat air patrol. 4 Wildcats and 12 Corsairs scrambled from carrier Shamrock Bay. They were 8 minutes out. The kamikaze aircraft were 3 minutes out. The math was unforgiving, and Becton knew it. He ordered general quarters. 336 men ran to battle stations. Gunners loaded the 5-inch main battery. Damage control teams deployed with fire hoses. Below decks, men dogged the watertight hatches and braced themselves. Every man aboard had performed these exact actions hundreds of times in drills. Their hands moved without conscious thought. Becton had bought that automation with months of grinding, hated repetition. Now they would spend it. At 0842, the first contact appeared. A single Japanese VAL dive bomber circling at 8,000 feet alone, conspicuously exposed. Reconnaissance. When Laffy's guns opened up, the VAL jettisoned its bomb and fled north, but not before its pilot had radioed the destroyer's exact position to every kamikaze in the formation. Becton understood the implication immediately. Every one of those 50 aircraft now had a navigation fix on his ship. They were all coming straight for him. At 0845-4, VALs broke formation and dove simultaneously from different directions. 2 from the starboard bow, 1 from the port stern, 1 from the starboard stern. A coordinated attack designed to overwhelm a ship's defensive fire by forcing it to engage in 4 directions at once. Against an unprepared crew, it would have worked. Against Becton's crew, it became a demonstration. Gun boss Lieutenant Paul Smith, seated in the director basket above the bridge, already had fire control solutions computed. Mount 51 and Mount 52 opened up on the first VAL at 4,000 yards. Shells bracketed it, walked closer, found it. Direct hit at 1,500 yards. The aircraft disintegrated. Burning pieces struck the water 200 yards off the bow. The second VAL took hits from the 40mm guns at 1,000 yards, lost its engine, and nosed into the ocean 50 yards from the hull, close enough that the water geyser reached 40 feet. The third VAL, coming in low and fast off the port stern, met Fire Controlman Lawrence Dukey at Mount 53. 20 years old, farm kid from Pennsylvania. He had practiced this exact shot 500 times. He didn't miss. The VAL shed pieces cartwheel and exploded 300 yards astern. The fourth VAL's wings separated under concentrated fire. It hit the ocean 100 yards out. 4 aircraft. 4 kills. 90 seconds. 0 damage to Laffy. Combat Air Patrol arrived overhead. The battle was 8 minutes old. Then the 9th kamikaze hit. And the 10th. And Laffy's rudder jammed hard to port, locking the destroyer into an endless circle. And the fires started burning from stern to amidships. And the list to port began creeping upward degree by agonizing degree. And Becton never left the bridge. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because what happened between that 8th hit and the final 22nd attack is where the real story lives. It's where you discover why analysts studied this battle for decades afterward. Why every damage control school in the United States Navy teaches the story of April 16th. Why a single destroyer's survival on a Tuesday morning in the Pacific changed Japan's strategic calculus about whether they could win the war at all. Because when the 22nd kamikaze finally broke apart in midair at 9:25 a.m. and the smoke began to clear over Laffy's shattered deck, the Japanese military command received a report that stopped them cold. 1 destroyer, 80 minutes, 22 attacks. And she was still afloat. In Part 2, we go inside those 80 minutes hit by hit, and we show you exactly how 336 men survived, what should have killed every single one of them. When we left, Commander Frederick Becton, USS Laffy, had already destroyed 8 Japanese kamikaze aircraft in 13 minutes. 6 men were dead. Mount 53 was burning. The rudder was still functional. The worst was yet to come. Here is the number that should stop you cold. By the time the battle ended at 9:25 that morning, the USS Laffy would absorb more direct kamikaze hits than any other destroyer in American naval history and still refuse to sink. But the story of how she survived doesn't begin on April 16, 1945. It begins 18 months earlier in the cold shipyards of Bath, Maine, with a commander that his own crew thought had lost his mind. And right now, at 9 a.m. on April 16th, that same commander was about to face the moment his entire career had been building toward. At exactly 903 kamikaze aircraft attacked simultaneously. Becton had dreaded this scenario since his first day of command. Not 2 attacks. Not staggered waves. 3 aircraft from 3 different directions at the same instant. It was called saturation, and it was designed specifically to overwhelm a destroyer's defensive capacity by forcing her guns to split attention in ways that guaranteed something would get through. The 11th attacker came from the port stern. Low and fast, a Val skimming the wave tops, making itself nearly impossible to track against the ocean surface. Every portside gun opened fire. They hit it repeatedly. Multiple impacts. The Val absorbed the punishment and kept flying. It crashed into Laffy's port side near the waterline and detonated. The explosion blew a hole 8 feet across through the hull plating. Seawater began pouring in immediately. Laffy took a list to port. Not dramatic yet. Maybe 2 degrees, but damage control. Chief petty officers below decks felt the ship shift beneath them and understood exactly what it meant. The 12th attacker came from the starboard bow simultaneously. A Judy diving steep, moving fast enough that the forward 5-inch guns had trouble establishing a firing solution. Mount 51 fired. Missed. Mount 52 fired. Missed. The 40mm battery picked it up at 1,000 yards and walked tracers up toward the diving aircraft connecting with the wing, then the fuselage. The Judy trailed smoke but didn't deviate 1 degree from its attack angle. It crashed into the starboard side amidships, penetrated the hull above the waterline, and exploded inside the crew's berthing compartment. 8 men died in the same instant. The electrical systems failed. Radar went dark. Fire control computers shut down. Every gun on the ship reverted to local manual control, meaning each mount was now operating independently, gunners tracking targets by eye without director assistance. The 13th attacker came from dead ahead while this chaos unfolded. Another Val. Mount 51 and Mount 52 both engaged simultaneously using full manual control. Now no computer assistance, no director targeting, just experienced gunners looking through optical sights and leading a moving target with instinct built from hundreds of hours of drilling. Both guns fired. The shells converged. The Val exploded in midair at 600 yards. Burning debris rained across the forward deck. Small fires ignited, and sailors beat them out with their uniform jackets. Becton assessed the situation in the seconds following those simultaneous attacks. List to port, approximately 5 degrees. Fires amidships and aft. Radar inoperative. Manual fire control only. Half the anti-aircraft armament destroyed or unmanned. Water entering through multiple breaches. 30 confirmed casualties. And the Kamikaze formation still had aircraft inbound. He had trained for this exact scenario. Not this specific sequence of damage, but the mental framework for functioning inside it. Every drill at 0300, every smoke-filled damage control exercise, every blindfolded loading drill had been preparing his crew for exactly this, the moment when everything breaks at once, and the only question remaining is whether the men inside the broken machine will keep working. They kept working. At 0903, the 14th attacker dove from the port quarter strafing as it descended, killing 2 more gunners on the exposed deck before crashing into the already damaged port side aft. The explosion widened the existing hull breach. The list increased to 7 degrees. Chief Engineer Lieutenant Commander Joseph Gunder reported water in 2 compartments, pumps running at maximum capacity but barely holding pace with the flooding rate. At 0905, the 15th attacker A, Judy traveling at nearly 300 knots, approached from starboard. Forward guns tracked it, fired, missed. The 40mm battery connected with the tail section. The Judy wobbled. The 20mm guns fired point-blank at minimal range bullets, walking up the fuselage, hitting the engine, hitting the cockpit. The Judy rolled right at the last possible moment and missed Laffy by 20 feet. It hit the ocean alongside close enough that the explosion sent a wall of water across the deck. Soaked sailors kept firing. Then, at 0907, Laffy's rudder jammed. Underwater explosions from near misses had been transmitting shock waves through the hull for 20 minutes. One of those shock waves finally found the steering mechanism. The rudder locked hard to port at 26 degrees of turn and stayed there. Permanently. Completely. Laffy began circling. Not drifting slightly, not trending gradually. Locked into a tight, continuous, uncontrollable left turn. Becton ordered all stop-ordered engines ahead, full-ordered engines back full. Nothing changed the circle. The ship was going to keep turning until she either sank or someone physically freed the rudder, and nobody was going into the water during an active kamikaze attack to attempt it. The 16th attacker came from starboard, while Laffy rotated beneath her crew's feet. Gun crews had to compensate not just for the incoming aircraft's movement, but for the ship's own constant turning beneath them. The Val's wing came apart under fire from Mount 52. The aircraft cartwheeled into the ocean 50 yards out. Its bomb separated during the crash, detonated underwater. The shockwave buckled more hull plating. Another leak opened. The list reached 9 degrees. Men were now visibly bracing themselves against bulkheads just to maintain their footing at battle stations. At 09:10, the 17th attacker crashed into the already devastated aft section and added more fire to an inferno that damage control teams had been fighting for 20 minutes. The heat was so intense that ready ammunition stored near the aft guns began cooking off spontaneously. Small explosions every few seconds, each one potentially the last, before a catastrophic magazine detonation that would end the ship instantly. Sailors grabbed shells with bare hands, burns registering somewhere distant behind the adrenaline, and threw them overboard. Because magazine explosion kills everyone. Burns kill you slowly. At 09:13, the 18th attacker dove from port bow. Mount 51 tracked it and fired. The shell passed close enough that the Judy visibly shuddered in the air, but continued. The 40mm battery found the wing root. The wing folded. The aircraft spun inverted and crashed 100 yards out. The blast knocked several men completely off their feet on deck. They got up and kept firing. 21 minutes into the battle. 17 enemy aircraft destroyed, 26 men dead, 40 wounded, fires burning on 3 levels, flooding in 4 compartments, list at 11 degrees, rudder permanently jammed, ship circling continuously, 5 more kamikaze aircraft still inbound. This is the moment naval historians return to repeatedly when they study the Battle of April 16th, because by any objective standard of damage assessment, USS Laffy should have been abandoned at this point. Standard Navy doctrine would have supported the decision. The ship was listing beyond the threshold associated with capsizing risk. Flooding was advancing faster than it was being controlled. Fires had compromised structural integrity throughout the aft section. Fire control systems were inoperative. The ability to maneuver was completely gone. And yet, not one man on that ship moved toward a life jacket, because Becton had not ordered it. And Becton was still on the bridge. Blood from shrapnel wounds dried on his face uniform, soaked through with seawater, voice reduced to a rasp from 90 minutes of shouting orders through smoke-choked air. He was still commanding, still thinking, still fighting. Lieutenant Frank Manson, the assistant communications officer, appeared beside Becton during a brief pause between attacks around this time. Manson was young, recent Annapolis graduate, a good officer by every measure. He looked at the fires, the flooding, the men being carried below the ship, rotating helplessly in circles. He turned to Becton and asked directly whether it was time to abandon ship. Becton didn't pause, didn't look away from the radar repeater he was studying. "We will never abandon ship as long as one gun can fire." That was the complete answer. Manson nodded once and returned to his station. A lookout standing nearby close enough to overhear said quietly to no one in particular that he'd keep firing if he could find one man to fire with him. Becton didn't acknowledge it. He was already tracking the 19th attacker. At 09:15, a Val came from the starboard quarter and began a strafing run that killed 3 more men on the exposed deck before transitioning to its dive. Mount 52 found it at 800 yards. Direct hit. The Val exploded in midair. Debris scattered across the ocean surface. The 20th attack came at 09:18. A Judy dead ahead, both forward mounts firing simultaneously. Mount 51's shell hit the propeller. Mount 52's shell hit the engine. The Judy disintegrated completely. The forward gun crew's men who had been loading and firing without stopping for 33 minutes, who were running on nothing but muscle memory, and the accumulated product of months of Becton's brutal drilling, those men cheered. The first sound of anything resembling celebration in the entire battle. 20 enemy aircraft destroyed. At 0920, the 21st attacker dove at an almost vertical angle practically straight down and approached geometry that made tracking nearly impossible for horizontal pattern gun mounts. The crew fired anyway, firing essentially straight up and missed. The Val hit 20 feet forward of the bridge, crashed through the deck, exploded in the forward crew compartment. 11 men died. The bulkhead between forward compartments blew out. Smoke poured up through the deck in dense black columns. Bridge crew could no longer see forward. List at 13 degrees. Stern almost underwater. Bow rising. Men struggling to stand on slanted decks holding railings. Weapons, anything fixed to the hull to avoid sliding into the water, washing across the lower portions of the main deck. One gun, operational forward. Maybe two remaining aft if their crews had survived the last impacts. At 0923, the 22nd and final Kamikaze appeared on the horizon. A Val. High and fast from the starboard bow. This pilot had watched 21 aircraft attempt this attack. He had observed what worked and what failed. He came in at a textbook dive angle aimed precisely at the bridge, intending to kill the command structure directly. Kill the captain. Kill the officers. Remove the intelligence directing the resistance. Mount 51 fired. Missed. Fired again. Missed. The gun crew was working on 36 minutes of continuous combat. Their arms were shaking. Their ears were bleeding from the concussive pressure of repeated firing. Their eyes were streaming from smoke. They fired a third time, and the shell passed under the Val's fuselage without connecting. The 40mm guns found the tail. Small pieces separated. The Val kept coming. The 20mm battery opened up at close range, hundreds of rounds per minute, hitting the engine, cowling hitting the windscreen, extracting a thin trail of smoke from the aircraft, but failing to alter its dive path. 400 yards. 300 yards. Then, a Corsair from Combat Air Patrol dropped from directly above a pilot who had been circling since the beginning, waiting for a clear firing solution that wouldn't endanger the ship below. 6 50-caliber machine guns firing simultaneously at 3,600 rounds per minute. The Val came apart in midair at 300 yards from Laffy's bridge. Wings separated from the fuselage. The bomb fell free and detonated in the ocean. Debris rained across the forward deck. Sailors stomped out the small fires the burning pieces started. Time: 9:25 a.m. Silence. The radar scope, the one that was still functioning, showed empty sky. Becton stood on the bridge of a dying ship, stern underwater. Bow raised 15 degrees, list 14 degrees to port. Fires on 4 levels, hull breached in 6 locations. 32 men confirmed dead, 71 wounded, and USS Laffy still afloat, still fighting. Exactly as he had promised months ago in the shipyard at Bath, Maine, when he stood on her deck for the first time and made a decision that his crew thought made him crazy. But the battle being over did not mean Laffy was safe. Because now came the question every damage control officer dreads more than enemy aircraft. The question with no heroic answer, no dramatic solution. Just cold engineering mathematics and rising water. Could the ship survive long enough to reach help? In Part 3, we follow the race to save Laffy against a flooding rate that was accelerating by the minute, and we reveal what the Japanese Imperial Command said in their classified after-action reports when they learned one destroyer had survived 22 attacks. The answer will change everything you think you know about why Japan surrendered. By 9:25 a.m. on April 16, 1945, the sky above USS Laffy was finally empty. 22 kamikaze aircraft had attacked her. 10 had scored direct hits. 32 men were dead. 71 were wounded. The ship was listing 14 degrees to port her stern, nearly submerged her rudder, permanently jammed fires burning on 4 levels simultaneously. She was still afloat. And the Japanese Imperial Navy's Strategic Command, when they received the after-action report later that week, convened an emergency session that would fundamentally alter their assessment of whether the war could still be won. Here is the number that triggered that meeting: 0. As in Zero, American destroyers had previously survived more than 4 kamikaze direct hits at Okinawa. Laffy had absorbed 10. The mathematics of the Kikusui strategy, the entire logical foundation on which Japan's last hope rested, had just been disproven by a single ship and 336 men who refused to follow the expected pattern. And now came the hardest part. Surviving the battle was one thing. Surviving the next 6 hours was something else entirely. At 0930, Fleet minesweeper Macomb appeared on the horizon, responding to Laffy's distress signals. She came alongside at 0945 and immediately began passing over firefighting equipment, fresh hoses, additional pumps, additional toolkits. Damage control teams who had not just fought for 80 minutes straight crossed over to the burning destroyer and joined the effort. Landing craft LCS-51 and LCS-116, which had fought alongside Laffy throughout the entire battle and shot down 6 kamikaze aircraft between them, moved closer and began transferring wounded men to their sick bays, giving Laffy's overwhelmed ship's doctor breathing room for the first time since 0842. Fleet tug Picana arrived at 1000 and took Laffy under tow. 3 knots maximum. The destroyer sat so low in the water that waves regularly washed across her stern, and men bailed with buckets alongside the mechanical pumps. Every hand not fighting fires was moving water. The mathematics of flooding are unforgiving. Water coming in faster than it leaves means the ship goes down regardless of heroism. Chief Engineer Gunder's teams were shoring up bulkheads with wooden beams, welding steel plates over the worst hull breaches with portable equipment, doing in combat conditions what normally required a dry dock and weeks of work. By 1100, the worst fires were contained. Not extinguished. Contained. Still burning in places, still dangerous, but no longer spreading toward the magazines. The flooding rate had stabilized. Water still entering through multiple breaches, but the pumps were keeping marginal pace. The ship was settling, but slowly. Not sinking. Not yet. Becton remained on the bridge for 7 consecutive hours after the battle ended. Blood dried on his face from shrapnel wounds he had not stopped to treat. His voice was gone, entirely reduced to hoarse whispers that officers leaned close to hear. His uniform was soaked through with seawater and sweat. He had not eaten, had not sat down, had not acknowledged his own injuries in any way that a man managing a crisis could not afford. Men looked up at the bridge and saw him standing there and found something in that image that kept them working when exhaustion said, "Stop." The tow to safety took the rest of the day and most of the following night. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, the report arriving from the Okinawa theater produced a reaction that Japanese officers, describing it later, would call, with remarkable consistency, disbelief. Admiral Matome Ugaki, commanding the Kikusui operations, had constructed his entire strategy around statistical certainty. Send enough aircraft simultaneously at a single target, and the target sinks. Every previous engagement confirmed this. 1 kamikaze might be shot down. 2 might be shot down. But 4 simultaneous attackers overwhelmed any destroyer's defensive capacity. The math was iron. It was proven. It was the foundation on which Japan's final strategy rested. Laffy had just destroyed that foundation. 22 aircraft, the largest single-ship kamikaze assault of the entire Okinawa campaign, and the target was still afloat, still under American control, being towed toward repair facilities. Ugaki's staff ran the numbers repeatedly. They kept arriving at the same impossible conclusion. The American ship had a crew survival rate under conditions that should have produced total loss that exceeded any previous recorded engagement by a factor that defied their models. The classified Japanese after-action assessment recovered after the war's end contained a passage that naval historians have quoted extensively. It noted that if American destroyer crews could maintain effective resistance under the damage levels observed on April 16th, then the projected casualty figures for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, required fundamental revision upward. The assessment estimated that American forces capable of absorbing this level of punishment while maintaining combat function would require losses on the Japanese side that Japan could no longer sustain. One destroyer, 80 minutes, and it cracked the strategic calculus that had kept Japan fighting. But this is where the story shifts from the water to the deck, because the human cost of those 80 minutes deserves precision. The final accounting completed April 17th as Pakana anchored Laffy off Okinawa for emergency repairs, established 32 confirmed dead and 7 missing presumed dead in flooded compartments that could not be safely accessed. 71 wounded, 23 of them critical. 6 kamikaze aircraft had physically crashed into the ship. 4 bombs had scored direct hits. Multiple near-miss underwater detonations had buckled hull plating in 8 locations. Lawrence Dookie, the 20-year-old Pennsylvania farm kid who had commanded Mount 53, had been blown clear of his turret by an explosion landed on deck 20 feet away, gotten up, and spent the next 40 minutes fighting fires with an extinguisher. He walked off the ship at Okinawa anchorage under his own power. Bob Robertson had lost his left eye to shrapnel. Fred Burgess had lost his left leg below the knee to the same blast amputated by the ship's doctor on the wardroom table with no remaining anesthetic. Burgess had bitten through a leather strap. Both men survived. The ship's doctor, whose name appears in records as Lieutenant Commander Carl Aroon, had treated 71 casualties over 90 continuous minutes under active combat conditions, with ammunition cooking off overhead and aircraft crashing within yards of his operating space. He had performed surgery while the ship listed 14 degrees with instruments sliding across tables and the smell of burning fuel penetrating every compartment. He ran out of morphine with 20 patients still waiting for treatment. He kept working. April 27th. Laffy reached Saipan under her own power. 1 engine. Emergency steering rig to compensate for the destroyed rudder mechanism. Moving at reduced speed, listing slightly sitting lower in the water than her designers ever intended, but moving under her own power. May 24th, she arrived at Tacoma, Washington, and entered dry dock at Todd Shipyards. The repair estimate was 4 months. The damage assessment took engineers 3 days to complete. 6 kamikaze impact points, 4 bomb craters, 8 hull breach locations. Structural compromise of the main deck across 40% of the ship's length. Complete destruction of the aft armament. Electrical systems requiring total replacement throughout the vessel. 1 damaged propeller shaft. Steering mechanism rebuilt from component level. The engineers at Todd Shipyard's men who had built destroyers and repaired battle damage throughout the war produced a report that contained a phrase which found its way into multiple official assessments afterward. They wrote that the damage pattern was inconsistent with a vessel remaining operational, and that the survival of the ship under observed combat conditions represented an outcome outside the parameters of standard structural analysis. Translation by the numbers: Laffy should have sunk. The engineers who built ships like her could not fully explain why she hadn't. Naval analysts studying the engagement identified 3 factors. Becton's training appeared first in every analysis. The drilling, the 0300 general quarters, the blindfolded loading exercises, the smoke-filled damage control drills, these had produced crew responses under catastrophic stress that functioned on pure conditioned reflex. When the electrical systems failed and fire control went manual, gunners didn't pause to process the change. Their hands knew what to do because they had done it hundreds of times in darkness and simulated chaos. When flooding began in multiple compartments simultaneously, damage control parties didn't need to think about procedure. Procedure was in their muscles. The jammed rudder appeared second. This required explanation because a jammed rudder sounds like pure liability. In isolation it was. A ship that cannot steer is tactically helpless. But the 26-degree permanent left turn that Laffy was locked into for the final 30 minutes of the battle created a targeting problem for incoming kamikaze pilots that significantly degraded their attack accuracy. Aircraft committed to a dive on a ship's predicted position had to recalculate mid-approach as the ship's actual position diverged from the projected track. Most misjudged. They hit the water. They hit sections of the ship already destroyed. The steering failure that should have ended Laffy measurably extended her survival time. The third factor was the Allen M. Sumner class hull design. Better internal compartmentalization than previous destroyer classes. More watertight subdivisions. Stronger bulkheads between sections. When a compartment flooded, the adjacent compartment held. When fire spread to a section, fire barriers slowed its advance. The engineering could flood magazines without losing buoyancy throughout the ship. Medical spaces remained functional, while combat continued on the deck above. Each system maintained a degree of independence from the systems around it. Presidential Unit Citation. Highest honor available to a naval unit. The citation described Laffy as having fought valiantly against waves of hostile suicide aircraft, maintained relentless anti-aircraft fire throughout extremely heavy and concentrated attack, suffered severe structural damage and heavy personnel casualties, and emerged at close of action still afloat and effective. Becton received the Navy Cross. 6 silver stars distributed among the crew. 18 bronze stars. 1 Navy Letter of Commendation. Captain Frederick Moosbrugger of Task Force 51.5 sent a message to Becton on April 22nd. It said that as long as Laffy remained somewhere in the Pacific, the Navy would always know where to find a punch in a pinch. It said they would remember that Laffy laughs last. Newspapers picked up the phrase. Radio broadcasts repeated it across the country. The ship that would not die entered the public consciousness in the final months of the war as something more than a naval vessel. She became evidence, proof that determination, preparation, and the refusal to accept inevitable defeat could produce outcomes that mathematics said were impossible. The Japanese strategic assessment, completed in late April 1945, circulated through Imperial General Headquarters with a conclusion that represented a fundamental shift in the internal Japanese military conversation about the war's outcome. If American forces at the unit level demonstrated the capacity for this order of resistance, then Operation Downfall would require Japanese casualties on a scale that Japan could not absorb. The home island's invasion, already dreaded, now carried projected losses that Japanese planners acknowledged in private they could not survive as a functioning military force. 1 destroyer changed those numbers. But here is the question that the medals and citations and strategic assessments don't answer. The question about the man who stood on the bridge for 7 hours. The man who had already lost 2 ships before this one. The man who drilled his crew until they hated him because he understood from personal experience with burning ships and drowning men exactly what the alternative looked like. What happened to Frederick Julian Becton after the guns went silent? What did he do with 30 years of peace after 80 minutes that defined his entire life? And what did the crew of USS Laffy, scattered across farms and factories and classrooms across America, carry with them from those 80 minutes for the rest of their lives? That story. The story of what survival costs and what it produces is the chapter of this history that almost nobody knows. And it is the most important chapter of all. In Part 4, we follow them home. 4 parts. 4 hours of story. And it all comes back to one man standing on a burning bridge, blood on his face. Voice gone to a whisper, refusing to leave his post, while 22 aircraft tried to kill him and everyone around him. Commander Frederick Julian Becton. Destroyer captain. Twice widowed by the sea before he was 35. The man who drilled his crew until they hated him because he understood from personal and devastating experience exactly what unprepared men looked like when a ship started sinking. He saved 304 lives on April 16, 1945. But here is the part of this story that almost nobody tells. The part about what a man does with the rest of his life after 80 minutes that define everything. The part about what the crew carried home. The part about what USS Laffy herself became when the guns went silent and the war ended and America tried to return to normal. Because this story has one final twist. and it changes the meaning of everything that came before. Frederick Becton came home to a country that celebrated its veterans loudly, and then with remarkable speed moved on. The war ended August 15, 1945, when Japan surrendered 14 weeks after the Battle of April 16. Becton received his Navy Cross. He attended ceremonies. He shook hands. He gave the expected answers to the expected questions. And then he went back to work because Frederick Becton was constitutionally incapable of doing anything else. His career after Laffy tells you everything about the kind of man he was. Promoted to captain in January 1951. Commanded destroyer divisions. Served in the Bureau of Naval Personnel. Commanded transport ship USS General William Weigel. Then, in September 1956, he received command of USS Iowa, the great battleship, 60,000 tons and 9 16-inch guns. A destroyer captain commanding the most powerful surface vessel in the American fleet. The Navy does not give battleships to officers it does not trust completely. But what Becton did with the institutional power that came with his rank matters more than the rank itself. He shaped Navy damage control doctrine for a generation. Every emphasis on crew preparation that he had developed through personal failure and personal grief through the loss of Aaron Ward and the first Laffy and the 60-plus men who went down with each of them, he translated that experience into policy. Damage control training intensification, redundancy requirements, crew readiness standards. His influence touched thousands of sailors who never knew his name and never would. He retired in 1966 after 35 years of service, settled in Wynwood, Pennsylvania, with his wife Elizabeth, and lived quietly for nearly 3 more decades. He died on Christmas Day, 1995. He was 87 years old. They buried him at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. His daughters were there, his grandchildren. The flag-folded ceremony that the country performs for its warriors with practiced precision and genuine respect. Lawrence Dukey, the 20-year-old farm kid from Pennsylvania who commanded Mount 53 and got blown clear of his turret and then got up and fought fires for 40 more minutes, went home to Pennsylvania after the war. Became a machinist, raised a family, lived a quiet life in the kind of American town that produced the men who fought at Okinawa, which is to say, a town where men worked with their hands and didn't talk much about the things that mattered most. He kept his Navy Cross in a drawer, took it out sometimes. That was enough. Bob Robertson lost his left eye to the shrapnel that hit him at 08:53 on April 16th, received a medical discharge, went home to Michigan, became a high school history teacher. He taught World War II to teenagers for decades, and sometimes, when the unit reached the Pacific Campaign, he would bring out his Purple Heart and explain to 17-year-olds what a kamikaze aircraft was, why young Japanese men flew them, and what it felt like to stand on an open deck with enemy aircraft coming at you from every direction. His students remembered those classes. Some of them went into the military because of what Robertson taught them, though Robertson never knew which ones. Fred Burgess, who shoved Robertson aside and took the shrapnel that would have killed the younger man who lost his leg below the knee, to a Navy doctor working on a tilted wardroom table with no remaining anesthetic, learned to walk on a prosthetic limb and became a carpenter. He built houses, built furniture, built a life with his hands one-legged, never complaining about it in any way that people around him could recall. The men who watched him take that shrapnel never stopped talking about it at reunions. Real heroism looks like that, they would say, like a man shoving someone else out of the way without thinking about it first. The crew of USS Laffy held reunions for decades after the war. Annual gatherings where men who had been 19 and 20 years old in 1945 became middle-aged men and then old men, still bound by 80 minutes of shared experience that nothing in the subsequent 50 years of ordinary life ever quite matched in intensity. They stayed in contact through letters, through phone calls, through the slow accumulation of shared memory that becomes the foundation of a particular kind of friendship that civilians sometimes struggle to understand. They had been reduced to their absolute essence together. Nothing after that, was quite as real. The Navy studied the Battle of April 16th extensively in the years following the war, and what emerged from that analysis shaped American naval doctrine in ways that remain visible today. The Allen M. Sumner-class destroyer design, already considered sound, was re-examined with specific attention to the compartmentalization principles that had allowed Laffy to absorb damage that should have been fatal. Those principles informed the subsequent Gearing class and influenced destroyer design through the Cold War era. The lesson was straightforward. A ship that can lose sections of itself and continue functioning as a whole is categorically more survivable than a ship where damage in one area cascades into total system failure. Becton's training methodology became a case study at the Naval War College and in every damage control school the Navy operated. The specific insight that crew performance under catastrophic stress is a direct function of conditioned reflex built through repetitive practice, not of courage or motivation or patriotism in the moment, became foundational doctrine. Courage is not enough when you cannot think straight. When smoke fills the compartment and the lights are out and shrapnel is flying and men are screaming. What saves lives is the action your hands know how to perform without waiting for your brain to authorize it. Becton proved this. His crew demonstrated it for 80 consecutive minutes against the most determined human assault one ship had ever faced. This principle, that preparation is the foundation of performance under stress, migrated out of naval training entirely and found its way into emergency medicine, aviation safety culture, nuclear power plant operations, and corporate crisis management over the subsequent decades. The crew resource management systems that airlines developed after a series of catastrophic crashes in the 1970s drew on exactly this logic that hierarchies freeze under stress and only flattened, rehearsed reflex-driven team responses produce reliable outcomes in genuine emergencies. The research that produced those systems cited military training doctrine, and the military training doctrine that influenced them had roots in exactly the kind of obsessive-hated, apparently excessive drilling that Frederick Becton imposed on 336 men in 1944. One destroyer captain's response to his own personal failures, to his grief over the men who died on Aaron Ward, and the first Laffy reached forward across decades and influenced how airline crews handle engine failures over the Atlantic, and how hospital trauma teams respond to mass casualty events. Becton could not have imagined this, but the principle he understood intuitively, that you practice for the worst possible moment, long before the worst possible moment arrives, has saved lives in contexts he never contemplated. By 1962, the Navy declared USS Laffy excess to requirements. Standard procedure, ships age, technology advances. The fleet moves forward. The paperwork went through for scrapping, and that might have been the end of it. Another warship recycled into the industrial machinery that the peace required. But Laffy's surviving crew members, now middle-aged men with families and jobs and lives built entirely in the civilian world, protested. They organized. They wrote letters. They made the argument that a ship with this particular history deserved a different fate than a scrapyard in New Jersey. They were right, and eventually the Navy agreed. USS Laffy was donated to Patriots Point Naval and Maritime Museum in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, arriving in 1981. She was moored alongside the aircraft carrier Yorktown, open to the public, and in 1986 designated a National Historic Landmark, the only surviving Allen M. Sumner-class destroyer preserved specifically for her record of survival against kamikaze attack. Here is the twist that nobody sees coming when they start this story. In 2008, 63 years after the battle that made her famous, USS Laffy began sinking. Not from Japanese aircraft. Not from bombs. From time and salt water and the slow relentlessness of entropy. Over 100 separate hull leaks had developed at her mooring. The ship that had survived 22 kamikaze attacks, that had absorbed 10 direct hits and refused to go down while her crew bailed with buckets, was quietly succumbing to corrosion at a museum dock in South Carolina. Officials assessed the damage and produced a repair estimate of $9 million. South Carolina provided a state loan. In August 2009, Laffy was towed to dry dock for the kind of comprehensive hull repair that her designers at Bath Iron Works had originally performed in 1944. New plating installed over the corroded sections. Rust removed. Fresh paint applied throughout. She returned to Patriots Point in April 2010, 65 years to the month after the Battle of April 16, 1945. The ship that would not die off Okinawa would not die at the dock either. There is something in that sequence that rewards thinking about. USS Laffy survived 22 aircraft because 336 men refused to abandon her. She survived the post-war decades because her crew scattered across the continent remembered her specifically enough to fight for her preservation. She survived the deterioration of 2008 because a state government decided that the story she represented was worth $9 million to keep alive. Each survival connected to the one before it. Each decision to not let her go made the next decision possible. Today, she sits at Patriots Point open daily to visitors who walk the same decks where Lawrence Dukey grabbed his fire extinguisher and Bob Robertson kept firing after taking shrapnel in the face, and Fred Burgess shoved a younger man out of the way without stopping to think about it first. The damage is preserved. Mount 53 still shows the impact marks from the Kamikaze strikes of April 16th. The deck plating bears the evidence of what happened. You can touch it. You can stand on the bridge where Becton stood for 7 consecutive hours and look at the water and try to imagine 50 contacts on a radar screen moving south at 200 knots. Most people cannot imagine it. But they can stand where it happened and feel the weight of it, which is different from reading about it and is closer to understanding it. From a destroyer captain who had already lost 2 ships and had every professional reason to accept that the third loss was inevitable to a crew of 336 men who were trained to the point of hatred and performed to the point of miracle, to a strategic reassessment in Tokyo that contributed to Japan's calculation that the war could not be won, to a doctrine that shaped how the United States Navy trains its people. To this day, the story of USS Laffy covers the full distance from one man's private grief to lasting institutional change. 32 men died on April 16, 1945. 304 came home. They built houses and taught school and raised children and attended reunions and grew old and carried 80 minutes inside them for the rest of their lives. The ship that would not die is still there. Go see her if you can, because the most important things we know about courage preparation and the refusal to accept inevitable defeat were written not in textbooks, but in hull plating by men with bare burning hands on a Tuesday morning in the Pacific when nobody was watching except the enemy, and the enemy could not believe what they were seeing.